National Federation of the Blind. Live the life you want.
I've been blind all my life, and I think that I have been very lucky for a number of reasons. I'm Dave Hyde from Wisconsin, and I am living the life I want. I started out with a mother who knew nothing about blindness, so she had nothing to unlearn. She had expectations, and she believed that I would do everything the other children did. The first time I knew there was something called blind and that it had something to do with me, I was living in naval housing in Chicago. My father was in the Navy. We had a neighbor who brought his new wife from the Philippines home, and they were expecting their first child. I walked in front of her one day and was pushed down a flight of 13 concrete stairs because she was afraid that I would mark her baby, and the baby too would be blind. I remember that I cried, and my mama screamed, and then it came time to explain to me that I wasn't quite like all the other children. I don't know if anybody ever explained it to my neighbor from the Philippines. So when I grew up as a blind child, things were a little bit different. I walked later. I talked earlier. My wife wishes I would stop now. I went to a school for the blind, and I was lucky. I had learned that there were things that blind children shouldn't do. So I did everything. I learned to read and write Braille, and nobody told me that Braille was hard or difficult, and so I learned to read it fast. I learned that blind kids were the same as sighted ones, and consequently, when we hired a drama teacher who knew nothing about blindness, she too had nothing to unlearn. And that meant that she had blind kids painting sets and building sets and working on the stage just like anybody else, and doing learning to move about the stage and knowing where they are and facing the audience. Nobody said you can't do that because you were blind. The first real play, the big musical I did was Peter Pan, and I was lucky enough to be light enough that they could fly me. And they rigged up ropes and pulleys to lift me into the air. And I learned to take off by running, and they'd pull me up, and landing because they started to slow down, lowering me. And that was great until the day in a performance that I missed my cue and swung. And I swung out over the audience. This proves Newton's law. Because if you, they told me to spread out so you'd slow down your swing, and I did that. Unfortunately, there was a lady in the second row that came in wearing a wig. I wasn't sure what my hand brushed off as I was swinging out over the audience, but I'm sure she knew. I had a lot of fun learning to act. It taught me skills that I needed. I graduated from the School for the Blind in the 9th grade, because that's as far as schools in Oregon went. I went to a public high school. And there I found that they had no idea what to do with a blind kid. So I went into drama and found out they didn't have any idea either. So my job was running lights and sound. I had no idea why they wanted me to run lights. College, I got my bachelor's degree. I went to work after a couple of years in the graduate program. And since my degree was in corrections, I went to work in a medium security adult prison. It was one of the interesting jobs I had. I found that the prisoners and most of the staff really didn't have much problem with the blindness. It was the security people that were concerned that blind people must lose things more than anybody else, and so it took me most of the 2 years I worked there to get a key to the restroom. After all, blind people must lose things better. And they thought that since it was secured for staff and they didn't want inmates sneaking in there, I would be a liability. I finally convinced them otherwise. I've been lucky because I've had a lot of jobs. I've always been able to get one. It got hungry around my house after I stopped working in corrections, and I looked in the paper and there was a job that said, wanted young motivated people willing to work hard for great rewards. And I said, yeah, sure, I'll take that one. And I applied and I got it. And I was selling insurance, door to door. My guide dog and I had a wonderful time going door to door to door to door selling insurance. We don't have time for the stories about that. Needless to say, I learned about myself, I learned about blindness. About that time, I ran into the National Federation of the Blind, and I had been an officer in the local chapter of the American Council when I was a young guy, and I was elected secretary because I was the only one who knew Braille. But I'd heard about those Federation people, and they were radicals. They weren't appreciative, and they didn't really like sighted people. They thought they were better than them. That's what I was told. And I got into the Federation, and when I came to my first convention in '76, I was amazed. There were blind people who thought like I did. They thought that civil rights, like the African Americans were fighting for in the 60s and 70s, ought to apply to blind people too. And I was hooked from the beginning. I found people who thought that running around a big hotel and doing things on your own and not getting a lot of help and managing on your own was what you ought to do. And I was hooked. So I ran for office in the state of Oregon where I lived. I won. They elected me president in '79. I stayed president of that affiliate until 1992. I was lucky. I got to work with the legislature. I got to work with politicians. I got to learn to write laws. I got to learn to read law books. I got to learn to write legislation. And it was all an education for everything else I got to do. In '96, I went to work as a computer instructor at the Colorado Center for the Blind. I could use computers I'd never taught, but it was a better job and I was working with adult blind people. I had been working for the State Library in Oregon for the last half dozen years in their technology program. So I went to work at the Colorado Center for the Blind, and again I was lucky. I had people who let me learn and let me learn to teach and let me find out for myself that I had patience. I could work with people well, and that everything I'd learned before was useful. I worked there for a half dozen years, and one of my students asked me if I'd like to go to Wisconsin. And I said, I don't know. What would I do there? He said, well, you have this opening and outreach, and you'd be working with teachers all over the state and putting classes together for them. And I said, sure, that sounds like fun. I applied. I got the job. The student that asked me to do that was our current president, Mark Riccobono. I believe the biggest reward that one can get for work is to see your students outstrip you in what they can do and what they do for others. In that sense, I think I have been very lucky. I have students now who are teachers. I've got students now who are teaching cane travel to children and adults. I have students who are working all over the country, and I am proudest of my student who is the president of the National Federation of the Blind.
For more information about the National Federation of the Blind, please visit www.nfb.org or call 410-659-9314.